Good afternoon and welcome back to Black Press USA Live. Congressman Bobby Scott has represented Virginia's 3rd Congressional District in the U.S. House of Representatives since 1993. Prior to Congress, he served in the Virginia House of Delegates from 1978 to 1983 and in the Senate of Virginia from 1983 to 1993. During his tenure in the Virginia General Assembly, Congressman Scott successfully sponsored laws critical to Virginia in education, employment, healthcare, social service, economic development, crime prevention, and consumer protection. His legislative successes in the state legislature included laws that increased Virginia's minimum wage, created the Governor's Employment and Training Council, and improved healthcare benefits for women, infants, and children. Congressman Scott has the distinction of being the first African-American elected to Congress from the Commonwealth of Virginia since Reconstruction, and only the second African-American elected to Congress in Virginia's history. It is our privilege to welcome Congressman Bobby Scott.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, Congressman, I know a lot is going on, and I want to start here because I know that I've heard you say many times, you've talked about distractions and not being distracted. There is so much information and misinformation being delivered today. How important is that message now?
Well, we really have to be focused because there are a lot of protests going on, and that's good. It sets the right climate, but people can't be focused only on protesting. There's an election coming up. And most of the problems that we're protesting against can be addressed if we elect the right people. Wrong people get addressed, we're going to be protesting for the next 4 years. And so we have to make sure that the energy involved in protesting is channeled into making sure people come out to vote. If you look at the Supreme Court and all the 5-4 decisions that we are on the losing side of, President Trump has appointed 2 members of that Supreme Court. Had it gone the other way, those 2 votes would have been appointed by Hillary Clinton, and all of those 5-4 decisions would actually be going 6-3 in our favor. All the voting rights, all the criminal justice, all the affirmative action, all of the freedoms that we hold dear, discrimination, would be going 6-3 in our favor, not 5-4 against us, if we had not lost Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin by razor-thin margins. So people need to make sure they come out to vote, and if they come out to vote, I think we can have success. It's just me to make. But if people just protest and don't vote, we may end up with the same situation. I think that 4 years ago, the day after the election, there was a huge protest. And watching that on television, all I could wonder was, well, where were y'all yesterday? The day after the inauguration, one of the biggest protests in American history. Well, where were you on election day? That's when we need you, so we can be celebrating rather than protesting after November 3rd.
Well, you mentioned the Supreme Court. Just yesterday, Vice President Pence pretty much threw a shot at Chief Justice Roberts. Did you see that? And if not, just so everyone will know, I mean, he lambasted him for going the other way. Have we seen anything like this? We've seen a lot of things in this administration that we hadn't previously seen. But have you seen anything like that before?
No, because usually the Supreme Court justices are appointed and they're expected to make the right decisions, whether they are popular or not. This administration expects people to make the political decisions and not the legally correct decisions. And so I'm not surprised that Vice President Pence has criticized the Chief Justice. Occasionally, he has not gone with the party line. But if you look at most of his decisions have been reliably conservative. When business and working people are in the Supreme Court, he sides almost exclusively with business. So it's just not surprising, but we can do something about that if we vote in November. And part of the problem is we have to fight the voter suppression. Um, we have to fight the fact that a few years ago, the Shelby decision, Shelby v. Holder, sabotaged the Voting Rights Act, and we have to put that back together. The House has several times passed legislation to fix it, but we need to elect, along with the president, we need to elect a Senate that will also pass the restoration of the restoring of voting rights that were sabotaged in the Shelby decision.
Yeah, and I want to get more into that in a moment. Congressman Scott, today, just before we came on air, there was some breaking news out of New York. The Attorney General, Letitia James, filed criminal charges against members of the high-ranking members of the National Rifle Association, alleging, among other things, fraud, mismanagement, diverting money from charities to their own pockets. How important is this battle, or this new these new charges, I should say, and the Attorney General of New York versus the NRAs, pretty much David versus Goliath here?
Well, let's let the evidence speak for itself. But there have been allegations about mismanagement. Oliver North was thrown out of office, and there were allegations going back and forth about not only mismanagement but money not being spent the way it was supposed to be spent. Let's just let the evidence speak for itself. I think if you look at the importance of an election, the Attorney General James in New York is very progressive. She won the election, and you can see the difference that election made. You also can see the Attorney General's office in Minnesota. You know, we usually overlook. You look at governor, sometimes lieutenant governor, but we tend to forget about the Attorney General. Keith Ellison was a former very active member of the Congressional Black Caucus. He ran for Attorney General of Minnesota and got elected in a close election. And he took over as Attorney General. He took over the prosecution in the George Floyd case. And shortly after he took over, the charges against the first officer were enhanced, and the other three were arrested. Now, what would have happened if he had not won that close election? If he had lost? All of the offices are important, not just governor, not just president, but attorney general, local prosecutors. If there's misconduct by a police officer and there's a question of whether criminal charges ought to be brought, the elected prosecutor makes that decision. Yeah. You get the wrong prosecutor, you're going to get the wrong result. And sometimes these are tough cases, and you may not like the decision, but you can have a lot more faith that the right decision was made if it's somebody that the community elected. And all over the country, people are realizing that the prosecutor is an important position. And if you want to talk about police misconduct, it's very helpful to have the prosecutor as somebody elected by the community.
Yeah, and to stick with the theme, I guess that goes toward voting, as you mentioned. We know that the Democrats in the House passed the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. Can you talk about why the Senate has neglected to take up the bill, and of course, the importance of this bill? And finally, Congressman, your recollection of your time with Congressman John Lewis.
John Lewis is just a remarkable person. The voting rights restoration just restores the voting rights before the Supreme Court messed it up, and makes other advances, and it's important that the bill pass. But meanwhile, people have to, as John Lewis would want us to do, keep our eyes on the prize, so that we're not distracted. We come out to vote. That's what he marched over the Edmund Pettus Bridge about, voting rights. And his life experience is just remarkable when you look at where voting rights were when he walked over that bridge, and where voting rights were when he passed. I mean, in Mississippi, there's some counties where you could almost name the African Americans who are registered to vote. Well, so let me see. You got Sam and Joe and Steve. I mean, you can almost name them. And now blacks are voting almost on par. In some elections, higher than their portion of the population in Mississippi and other states. It's just look, and that didn't take it wasn't done overnight. You needed the Voting Rights Act. You needed to implement the Voting Rights Act. After you have the right to vote, you got to register people to vote. People don't, unfortunately, people just don't register themselves. It takes a lot of work. And that work was done, and John Lewis was always in the middle of it. He recognized that the elective process is so important if you want to make change. After he finished protesting, he ran for city council in Atlanta, and of course, in 1986, ran for Congress and was elected and served with distinction. I mean, it was just such an honor to have a person like that in your midst. And he talked with a moral authority. When he said things, you couldn't argue with him because he's right. And so he always had an optimism that we're going to make progress. He was never bitter. He was just content that if we keep working hard, we'll keep making progress. He didn't want revenge over anybody. Let's just keep making progress. And seeing somebody showing no bitterness for things that happened to him in Selma, Alabama, and other places as he was protesting, and just to be in his midst was an honor all of us enjoyed.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that about Congressman John Lewis. We just recently were speaking with someone else, and I'm failing to recall which legislator was telling us this story, but he even forgave and welcomed those officers who brutally beat him at the Pettus Bridge.
No sense of seeking revenge, no sense of bitterness. He was focused. Keep your eyes on the prize. Focused on continuing to make progress. And the natural inclination is to want to get back at somebody, and that's just diverts you from your efforts. And you could see it every day in his work. We're going to make progress. We're going to keep working. We're going to introduce the bills. We're going to fight for the legislation. We're going to make progress. And just totally oblivious to the need, no need for bitterness, no need for revenge, no need to get back at people. If people, yeah, of course he's going to say fine, and he's not going to waste a lot of time with on that because he wants to go forward.
Right.
And so he's going to welcome everybody. And if you noticed on Twitter and Instagram, everybody had a picture with themselves and John Lewis.
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of people you can't find, don't want to stop. John just, he was pleasant. He would always stop. Of course, you can get a picture. There's so many people have pictures with John Lewis, and everybody's honored. But his focus on continuing to make progress and his faith in voting, something that I think we all need to remember.
Yeah, and Congressman, you have done as much as anyone legislatively on education. We just saw what happened in a school district in Georgia with reopening. What is your take on when and how reopening should be handled?
Well, first of all, let's be clear. We need to reopen the schools. The achievement that can be achieved by the students, the academic achievement is much better when you are physically in the school. Your social and emotional maturity, better when you're in the school. Better nutrition when you have access to the school meals. If there's child abuse going on, it's easier to identify if the child is in the school. And let's get serious. You're not going to open the economy until you've opened the schools. So we need to open the schools if it can be done safely. If it can't be done safely, you can't do it. Now, there are things that have to happen in the school. You got to spend some money. You got to do it right. You got to do the planning. You have to have a plan. there is no plan coming from the federal government. The plan of the federal government is open the schools, so I'm gonna cut your funding. That is not a plan. We had a GAO report come out just a few weeks ago that showed that in 40% of the school districts in this country, they need, in more than half their schools, they need to repair, replace the ventilation systems, HVAC systems, heating, ventilation, air conditioning. In more than half the schools. That's in 40% of the districts. Now, the CDC has said that ventilation is an essential element to safety in the schools. That's why, you can eat outside in a restaurant, but not inside, because if you're inside, everybody's breathing, somebody's got the virus, it's in the air, and you got a problem. If you have proper ventilation, less problem. Now, all those schools with improper ventilation need to be fixed. The schools, if they had the money, they would have fixed it. They don't have the money. But in the Moving Forward Act, the infrastructure bill that just passed the House, there's $130 billion for school construction. That you've never seen an infrastructure bill with school construction in it, but squeaky wheel gets the grease. And as chair of the Education and Labor Committee, I squeaked, and so squeaky wheel got some grease, and we have education money in there. And now everybody's noticing we need that money for education. If you don't pass that, then how are you going to have proper ventilation, sanitizing, PPEs? What's your transportation plan? You got half the kids in the buses. Well, you need twice as many buses, or twice as many trips. How's that going to work? Are you going to have counselors in the schools with all the trauma involved and not being in school? Are you going to have counselors? Are you going to have nurses? If a child has a runny nose, who's going to make the diagnosis of whether it's a common cold or COVID-19? If you don't have a nurse, I mean, what's up with that? We can't wait for serious symptoms. They had a meatpacking plant, 3 people showing symptoms. They said, well, let's test everybody. Hundreds of people tested positive, hundreds. So you need testing. Somebody's got to pay for that. You got to have somebody to administer the test. You got to have nurses. You got to have counselors. You got to have transportation plan. You got sanitizing. That we had a witness come before a committee, said that in Tennessee they have disinfection for every classroom. Well, it's not going to disinfect itself. You have custodians, or we just tell the teachers, stop doing those simple lesson plans and start being a custodian. What is the plan? And ventilation, because a lot of the classrooms are inside, a lot of the windows don't open. So if you don't have a proper ventilation, and that costs money. Now, the first thing in the HEROES Act that we're arguing about is whether there's going to be help for state and local government. If you don't have state and local government, just shut up, because you're wasting the time of anything else. These state and local governments have revenue shortfalls that will require them to cut everything across the board, and education isn't going to be spared. We saw that in Virginia. The General Assembly session ended right before the pandemic started. 6 weeks later, we had the regularly scheduled veto session, what we call veto session. We consider governors' amendments and vetoes. In between, they reforecast revenues. And we're cutting everything right and left. The teacher raises, counselors in the schools. Norfolk State University lost $130 million in construction. They called it unallocated. Now, if we can get them their money back, it can be reallocated. But if you don't have state and local money, they will cut education more than we can appropriate money. So if the Senate in their bill doesn't have any money for state and local, anything they say they have for education will just partially offset the cuts that are coming. But we have state and local money, and we have money for education to offset the expenses needed. You got to deal with this achievement gap, because if you're doing distance learning, those at the bottom need more help. They need computers, they need connectivity, they need extra tutorial. And if you don't provide that, those that are behind are going to be further behind before this is all over. Special education. How do you teach special ed? You got to. It is more expensive. You need more money, so you need the state and local first to stabilize the budgets. Then you need more money, and then you need the construction. So you ask, how do you open the schools? You got to have a plan, and you got to have resources. You just can't say, open the schools, so I'm gonna cut your funding. Is not a plan.
Yeah.
And so we have the Democrats have been talking about this on and on. You just can't invite 2,000 children into a high school and think, nope, you're not going to have an epidemic all through the high school if you do not have proper planning.
Yeah.
And so most of the school districts, when they start trying to do the planning, look up and say, well, wait a minute, I think we're going to open up at first all virtual, and then in about 9 weeks we're going to try to plan the best we can. In 9 weeks we might have it straight, and they might have given us some money to work with, and we might be able to come in person. But I think most of the schools are concluding that this, without a nurse in the school, without the ventilation systems fixed, this is not a good idea.
Yeah, absolutely. And speaking of the HEROES Act, we know that Speaker Pelosi, Leader Schumer, and the White House have been negotiating for the past 10, 11 days. Have you been brought up to speed? Where are we right now? Is there any optimism that a deal can be done?
Well, I think, as Speaker Pelosi says, we're dealing with people that do not agree on the basic values. Here we are arguing about whether somebody ought to get $600 a week when they're unemployed. At the same, and they don't want to. They said it was a budget busting deficit. They said nothing about budget deficit when they gave $1.5 trillion with interest, $2 trillion tax cut, 80-some% went to the top 1% in corporations. That didn't. They weren't concerned about the deficit then. But when somebody, and it's this $600, when you lose your job, you lose your insurance, health insurance. How are you going to pay for health care? You need that $600. It has been, if you talk to people, it has been a lifesaver. A lot of people were on the edge to begin with. I mean, the evictions were, I mean, the courts were full of people getting evicted before the pandemic. And you don't want people being evicted in the middle of a pandemic. You don't want them losing their health insurance in the middle of a pandemic. And so the $600 has allowed people to survive. We told them, look, you got to close down your businesses. You got to close your barbershop. You got to close down. And everybody did it because it was the right thing to do. But you can't, I mean, you got to help them get through it. The $600 is one lifeline. The other is we expanded unemployment compensation. We also expanded it. People who never gotten compensation before, self-employed, independent contractors, gig workers, all are getting unemployment compensation. Barbers. I mean, you know, in a slowdown, we never closed down the barbershop because there's high unemployment. But now we told them to close down. Now, what are they going to do? We give them unemployment compensation. And if you look at what we're doing for workers, this is just a values thing. They're talking about this liability. Nobody, to my knowledge, in America, you got 150,000 people who have died. No one has successfully sued a business for COVID-19. You got to prove, first of all, you got it on the job, not on the way to work or not somewhere else. Then you got to prove it was the employer's fault that you inquired. And so they're going to take that little bit away. On the Democratic side, however, we want to make sure that OSHA is in there, making it less likely you're going to get it, that we're doing more testing. So if somebody's on the work site sick, they can get out. We want to make sure that if you're treated for COVID-19, no copays and deductible. If it's a federal worker, that's what we got jurisdiction over. It's presumed to be workers' comp, so your lost wages and health costs are covered. That we want to make sure you got insurance with subsidizing insurance after you leave your job, or Medicaid expansion, or lowering the subsidy, increasing subsidies, making Obamacare easier to pay. We want to pay HEROES pay. If you're one of these dangerous jobs, $13 an hour extra up to $10,000, more paid leave. That's what we do about the problem of people getting sick on the job, infected by COVID-19. What do the Republicans offer? not only nothing, they're going to take away a little bit of right people have today. And that's when you said, what's the difference? This is what Speaker Pelosi is saying. We are concerned about workers getting sick, going bankrupt on these bills. And that's why we've already made vaccines free if they ever get a vaccine. But we want to make sure that the workers are being taken care of. 150,000 people have died already. Almost 5 million people have contracted the disease. We want to make sure we can get through this pandemic by making sure they have the health care. We reduce the chances they're going to get it, and extra pay. And the Republicans are offering nothing, not only nothing, worse than nothing. They're taking away some of the rights that the people have. And so trying to negotiate with people like that is difficult. Speaker Pelosi is doing the best she can. She is a very strong negotiator, and I think we're going to be all right. The Republicans don't think they're going to do state and local support, and Speaker Pelosi says they're going to do state and local. They just don't know it yet.
They just don't know it yet. Yeah.
They just don't know it yet.
Congressman, and we're with the great Congressman Bobby Scott from Virginia. We know time is running short, but there's a couple more we wanted to make sure that we get your thoughts on. And one being, we anytime now, Joe Biden is going to select the vice president. And we keep hearing three names that are supposedly the finalists, and all three are African Americans. What is your take on this? I call it the vice presidential sweepstakes.
Well, I've heard five finalists, three of whom are African American. Karen Bass, who's an exceptional legislator, former Speaker of the House in California. Kamala Harris, the senator from former prosecutor in San Francisco, Attorney General in California, U.S. senator who ran for president and at one time was leading in the campaign. Susan Rice, who knows more about foreign policy than anybody on the list. Three exceptional candidates, but you've also got others. Tammy Duckworth, who is a veteran, strong veteran, and also disabled. The disabled community hadn't been represented on a ticket since Franklin Roosevelt, and he kind of hid his disability, so a lot of people didn't know he was in a wheelchair. And Elizabeth Warren, who knows more about wealth disparity than anybody in public life right now. So I mean, you've got five exceptional candidates who individually would bring a lot to the ticket. And I don't think the vice president can go wrong picking any of the five. I'd like him to pick an African American, but when you say it should be an African American, you're not going to nominate somebody in general. You're going to nominate a person. And if you nominate Susan Rice, you're not going to get just African American woman. You're going to get somebody very knowledgeable on foreign policy. Karen Bass, somebody who's been able to work. You've seen her work on the policing bill. Very effective legislator. Kamala Harris. I mean, you get different strengths with each of the three, and depending on what strength you want to emphasize, you have somebody to pick. But he's got five candidates. Go pick somebody, and my goal is to make sure that he and whoever he picks, they get elected on November 3rd.
Well, Congressman, a few months ago, Vice President Biden himself floated a particular name, and there's still a petition going around to draft this individual. And you're smiling. I guess you know who I'm talking about. How about Michelle Obama?
I think she has taken her name out of contention, but that would be an exceptional choice. She's probably just on popularity. She's probably one of the most popular public figures in America today. So that would, he can't go wrong. Just pick somebody, and let's make sure that we can win this election.
And and speaking of Biden, his campaign yesterday announced that they have reserved the largest ad buy in history, $280 million in total, which includes, and in a lot of cases, targets African-American media. How important is it, Congressman, for a candidate to get his message out through Black-owned media? And keep in mind, my question highlights Black-owned, not just media that has African-American participation.
Well, I know exactly what you mean. The Black newspapers are an exceptional outlet for media. It is a very credible source in the Black community. When you read it, you know you're getting the right information. We've got two very long-standing members of the association, the Free Press in Richmond and the Journal and Guide in Norfolk. Have been long-standing members of your organization and are very well respected in the community. As a matter of fact, when I was in high school, I sold Journal and Guide as a summer job, so I've known them for a long time. And so it's important that that you use these outlets, but it's also important to support the media. I mean, these are also small businesses that that need the support, and so you're supporting their ability to stay alive, and you're getting your message out in a way that I think is a very credible source. So I think we've gotten the message, and the Black newspapers should expect significant advertising in throughout the country, and the message will get out. We'll know what the issues. We already know what the issues are. I mean, it's um, we know what to do, but it's helpful to get the message as you're articulating it, what the speaking points are and things like that. It's good to get that, but we need to just make sure we get out, register our friends, and get out to vote. Vote early. People don't want to wait until election day to vote. Just about every state you have some access to early voting, so that you can vote either by mail or early vote in person, where you don't expect the line. If the lines are long, you can just look at the lines and go home, because you can do it tomorrow or the next day. But you make sure that you vote before, on or before election day. A lot of these states will be close, and a few people being discouraged or being talked out of voting because of voter suppression. That's clearly could make the difference.
Yeah, and before we let you go, Congressman, we certainly wanted to get your thoughts on the census. We know that there was an announcement by the Census Bureau that they're going to end the count next month. How important is it to get this count completed?
Well, they have identified a lot of what are called hard to count areas, people that are slow in returning the census forms, and they tend to be communities of color, low income, and communities of color, and they're always undercounted. And so I know in my district, almost a third of the people haven't filled out the forms yet. Supposed to have done it in April. About a third of the people in my district haven't filled out those forms. Now, two things happen. One is, which is frequently mentioned, when money is distributed, it's per capita. So how many people are counted, that's how much money you get. It's estimated that it's about $2,000 a person over 10 years. So if if 100 people don't fill out the forms, that's $200,000 the city didn't get because people didn't fill out the forms. So the money is extremely important. The other is representation, because it's one man, one vote, the size of the districts. If you aren't counted, you may find districts where you have to go out and find more people and look up, and some districts represented by African American legislators all of a sudden disappear. Where you had 3 or 4, now all of a sudden you've got 2 or 3. If people don't fill out the forms, we could lose representation. A lot of votes in the legislature, obviously close. You need as many people in there voting on your side as possible, and you can't afford give up seats just because people didn't fill out the forms. And so it's extremely important, if you haven't filled out the census, that you do that as soon as possible.
Yeah, and we also need it for schools as well. The census count, that
That's
money.
the money.
Yep,
Money.
exactly. Well, Congressman Bobby Scott from Virginia, we always appreciate you. Keep up the great work, and we'll see you again.
Good, thank you. Enjoyed it.
Stay safe and stay well.
You too.